Welcome back to the workshop series. We're back again on generative AI, technology that is able to take text prompts and produce human-like creative work, like art, music, or text. Last time, we discussed the general principles behind generative AI that are most important from my perspective as a lawyer, including how it's made and what uses it may have in the business world. If you didn't watch the last video, go do that. This is a complicated field, and some of the points that I'm going to be making assume that you're familiar with the basics of what the technology is and how it can be used. This time, I'm going to discuss whether generative AI itself is legal or illegal as currently constructed. That is there anything about the way in which generative AI is created and trained, or something else about it, that is inherently unlawful? It doesn't take very much digging online to find people who think it is. The recording industry has no problem sending cease and desist letters to people using AI to make songs using the voice of existing singers. Visual artists abound online, complaining that the AI is stealing their artwork. Are they right? Is there something fundamental about generative AI that is unlawful? That's the topic for today. Note that this is just general legal information, however, and a lot of opinion. There are pending lawsuits on this point, and there may be, and probably should be, federal legislation. This law is going to change. But that's not going to stop me from telling you what I'm observing today. The major challenge to generative AI comes under copyright law. That makes sense, since copyright is the law that governs creative works like stories, songs, or pictures. The major argument made by existing creators, to boil it down, asserts that when the programmers training the generative AI use copyrighted works in their datasets that create the model, they are infringing on copyright. Remember that the end result of training a generative AI is to create something called a model. Think of that as a complicated map that connects text input to some kind of output. The programmer doesn't explicitly design the workings of the model. She designs the datasets and the methods that train the model. To train the model, the programmer needs a large set of data associating text prompts and the kind of output that it's training on. The model runs over this data and gets rewarded when it gets closer to correctly producing the output associated with that prompt. For a large language model, for example, the model is presented with massive dumps of human text. Think most books ever written and much of the internet. It then is trained to predict the next word given the prior words. For image-generating AI, it is trained to be able to mimic images based on text descriptions. And yes, I know I'm glossing over the details here, like the role of transformers or the diffusion process or any number of other clever techniques used by generative AI, but it's not clear to me that those aspects matter from a legal perspective. What matters is that it requires existing human creative work to train on, and a ton of it, some of which is copyrighted. Why does it need all this data? Well, think of it like this. The final model in generative AI can be described as an insanely complicated, multidimensional mathematical equation. You may remember from school that you can define shapes using equations, right? Well, generative AI breaks down the creative works into numbers, plots them on a graph, and finds the equation that most closely matches those plot points. Except instead of finding the line that best matches a bunch of ordered pairs, generative AI finds the equation for a complicated curves in thousands of dimensions that matches the data. The more data, the more detailed the curve. The fact that generative AI needs these dumps of pre-existing creative works to train on has led to the first lawsuits against this technology. There are 3 cases pending at the moment that I'm aware of in the 9th and the 2nd Circuits. In Anderson v. Stability AI, artists have filed a class action against generative AI that used their art for training. In Getty Images, also versus Stability AI, the popular stock photo company Getty Images is likewise suing because it was trained on their stock photos. Finally, in Doe v. GitHub, programmers are suing a code-producing generative AI that was trained on the computer code written by contributors to GitHub. In each case, the plaintiffs are claiming that when the programmers used their creative work to train the model, they violated their intellectual property rights. It seems to me that the existing law is against those plaintiffs for two reasons. First, it's not entirely clear that the model created after training is actually copying a protected element of the original work. And second, to the extent that copies are made during training, existing cases suggest that that is probably fair use. Now, that doesn't mean an individual user can't get in trouble for infringement based on how they use the tools. It just means that, as far as I can tell, the tools themselves are probably not going to be rendered illegal. Copyright law is federal law in the United States. It arises from Article 1 of the United States Constitution and has been enacted in the United States Copyright Act. Copyright protects creative works like books, music, scripts, pictures, and sound recordings. Creators get an exclusive right to utilize their creative works. They also have an exclusive right to create derivative works, such as adaptations or translations into a new medium. So, the first problem with people talking about having their voices or styles or unique talents stolen by generative AI is that those are not parts of the actual work itself. And so they're not really the kind of things that copyright protects. It protects the individual works, not the ideas or techniques behind them. Under the Copyright Act, quote, "In no case does copyright protection for an original work of authorship extend to any idea, procedure, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery, regardless of the form in which it is described, explained, illustrated, or embodied in such work." So, if you paint a picture, the picture is protected by copyright. But the way you held your brush is your style, your insights, your methods. Those are not protected. Similarly, Ninth Circuit case law holds that a singer's voice is not copyrightable. This is problematic for those trying to outlaw generative AI. The models that fuel these systems do not store elements of the works on which they were trained. Instead, the models store maps of relationships between text prompt input and visual or whatever elements as output. The models are a map of human descriptions of works to the kind of elements of works that are meaningful and named by humans. It's easier to say that the models are learning how humans describe works than that they are compressing or storing the works in any meaningful way. The plaintiffs in Anderson argue the models should be seen as compression or collage tools, because they argue the elements that the model is learning how to write should be viewed as compressed versions of the original art. On the technical side, this seems pretty suspicious to me. GPT-4 was apparently trained on about 45 terabytes of data, yet the entire model only takes up 45 gigabytes of space, 1,000 times smaller. Just so you know how insane that is as compression, zipping a file on Windows saves you about 30%. If this was just compression, large language models would be saving on the order of 99.9% of space. Not likely. I can see the conceptual point, though. Maybe the idea is that the end results of this map have to have some version of the original elements in order to know what to draw. But in close call situations like this, where the allegedly copied element is really close to the ideas or the methods behind the work, the courts so far say that that is not a protected element of the work. The Supreme Court dealt with this issue very recently in Google v. Oracle. In that case, which may have been primarily responsible for why people use Python instead of Java nowadays, Oracle sued Google for infringement, claiming that copyrighted elements of its Java program were being used by Google. The code in question labeled and organized certain computer tasks into packages or classes. The Supreme Court admitted that computer code could be protected by copyright in general. And Oracle did have copyright protection for aspects of its code. But the particular code at issue was mostly organizational in nature, like filing on a filing cabinet, and existed for the purpose of encouraging third parties to use the code to accomplish other non-infringing purposes. Thus, the code was inherently bound together with uncopyrightable ideas and was further than most computer programs from the core of copyright. I don't know why the same would not also be true here. If the model's maps of relationships between text prompts and artistic elements is close to an element of the existing work, it is so inexorably connected to the methods and ideas behind it that it seems Oracle would mean it's not copyrightable, even if the models could be said to be infringing on copyright in some way. The next problem for plaintiffs is going to be the fair use defense. Fair use exists because the Copyright Act strikes a balance between protecting the creator's rights to use and profit from their creation, on the one hand, and society's ability to innovate, iterate, and be inspired by those creations on the other. Certain kinds of use, like criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, research, they're specifically allowed, even if they do involve copying a protected work. Fair use is why you're allowed to comment on, teach about, and make parodies of works in most circumstances. To decide whether something is fair use, courts look at 4 factors. 1, the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for a nonprofit educational purpose. 2, the nature of the copyrighted work. 3, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyright work as a whole. And 4, the effect of the use on the potential market or the value of the copyrighted work. Let's run through each one of those and see how they apply to generative AI. As to the first element, the purpose and character, this actually breaks down into court decisions into 2 sub-elements: how the work is being used and whether it is transformative. Now, that first factor didn't used to be a big deal in the courts, but in May, the Supreme Court issued a new decision that probably made it much more important. In a case between 2 dead famous people, the late artist Andy Warhol's foundation was sued over selling a Warhol image based on a photograph of the late artist Prince. The photo was being used in a magazine article about Prince to depict Prince. The Supreme Court found that this commercial use, an image of Prince, decorating an article about Prince, was exactly the same as what the photographer would do with its photograph. Since the use was the same, this weighed against fair use. The majority was careful to explain that they were not saying that it was infringing for Warhol to make art based on the photograph in the abstract. And Justice Gorsuch, in a concurrence, noted that displaying in a museum would probably be fine by him. But it was not okay for Warhol's piece to be used commercially in an identical manner to the original photograph. You might already see how this analysis gets awkward for generative AI. The end result of the training is a model of relationships. It's a tool that can be used to create new works. It isn't an individual new work itself. It seems difficult to argue that a particular artist's particular work is for the same commercial use as an engine that can be used to create infinitely many new works. And this gets into the second part of that first fair use element, transformation. The more transformative the use is, the more likely it is to be fair use. Transformative means that the new work adds something new with a further purpose or different character and alters the first with a new expression, meaning, or message. In 2 more cases involving Google, courts have held that systems similar to generative AI are transformative fair use. In Perfect 10 v. Google, a website that made a living selling images, sued Google and others for posting small previews when the user searched for it. In Authors Guild v. Google, authors sued Google for allowing search engines to crawl through their published works. And in both cases, Google won. The courts concluded that giving users access to new abilities, like searching, data mining, and so on, was transformative. The Second Circuit and Authors Guild didn't even think this was a close call. They called adding a new functionality, as Google did, a, quote, quintessentially transformative fair use. Under these cases, it seems pretty likely that using existing art as grist for the mill to create an art engine would also be transformative. And the models that get created will serve a different purpose from the original works themselves. An individual visual image doesn't serve the purpose of being a machine to spit out other images any more than Google search functionality of books serves the same purposes as reading the original books do. The second fair use element is the nature of the copyrighted work. It has to do with whether the original work was factual versus creative, whether it was public or private, and I don't see a lot of action going on here for generative AI. It's going to depend upon the work in question, but there are a lot of creative works in the training sets, and all of it was public, mostly online. The third fair use element is the amount and substantiality of the portion used. As I mentioned above, generative AI is a little tricky because the model itself is not a work of art. Not in the sense we're talking about. Usually, in a copyright case, you have a particular new work or a new song or whatever, and you compare it to the original. Comparing a model to one part of its training data is kind of apples and oranges, until it actually spits out an infringing copy. How can you measure the amount it copied? Well, there is one point in the training process where maybe you could ask this question. Remember, the original training involves seeing how well the model is able to replicate its training data. And of course, the training requires making a copy of the original works to start from. Making a digital copy of something, even just storing it in RAM, can be enough to support infringement. The problem here is that existing decisions also suggest this kind of intermediate copying that's done along the way by someone who's making something transformative is probably fair use. In Sega v. Accolade, Sega sued a company that was copying its code in order to try and reverse engineer a lockout chip that stopped Accolade from making games for the console without Sega's permission. In Sony v. Connectix, Sony argued the same thing concerning the creation of emulation software that let people run games on non-native hardware. In both cases, the court upheld the right of others to infringe while reverse engineering. Reverse engineering is okay, usually, because it is being done to get access to the underlying ideas and the processes behind the work. Those underlying ideas are not copyrighted. Sega or Sony suggest that making these kind of copies along the way to get at this unprotected stuff is okay. So, with generative AI, I would suspect the same reasoning would apply. If the model is getting at the underlying methods used to create the artistic works, the relationships between words people use to describe art and what the art looks like, then it would seem like this intermediate copying is acceptable. It's true that in prior cases, the reverse engineering was computer hardware, and now the device being reverse engineered might be said to be the human mind itself, at least the creative bits. But it's not clear why the rule would be any different. We'll see how that shakes out, I guess. Finally, the fourth factor in fair use is the effect on the market of the original work. Now, I don't doubt for an instant that generative AI has an impact on the market for the kind of works it can mimic. If you give every middle manager software that can automate written work product, there's less demand for humans to do bad writing. Perhaps the software isn't as good as writing as the best humans or even competent humans, but it is already better than some humans. Studies are suggesting, moreover, that generative AI in the hands of experienced workers can make them between 14 and 30% more productive, depending on the task. More work product out of the same number of workers means more supply. More supply means lower prices usually, so yes, market impact. That said, courts do not find every market impact to be a problem under the fair use analysis. Creators are not guaranteed a market for their work. Automation can and does displace workers by outcompeting them. Instead, the market for fair use purposes is probably much more narrow than just generic supply and demand. As the court in Warhol seemed to reiterate, the kind of market force that weighs against fair use tends to be where the new work is a mere duplication of the original that serves as a market replacement for it. But one artist can't sue another artist because they're both competing in the market for art. A generative AI model does not replace a particular short story, Rather, it allows for the cheap and fast creation of new stories, some of which might infringe, some of which may not. The model itself is not replacing the work. Now, we end up in a situation that's probably very unsatisfying for artists. I get that. They see their works are being copied without permission. They also see the demand for their services as being harmed. The problem is that the connection between these two is not really the kind of connection that existing cases would find infringing, at least as far as I can see. Instead of just selling copies of someone's photo, generative AI is dissecting everybody's photos and using what it learns to design a machine that spits out new photos on demand. This machine can then provide a market alternative to the original artists, at least for basic work and less picky customers. This is painful. But it's a pain that manufacturers and others who were replaced by automation have been suffering for hundreds of years, each time new technology is created. And I say all of this knowing that I, as an attorney, am one of the industries that could be impacted by more people being able to churn out written work product. I know that there are some people who will, perhaps foolishly, rely on ChatGPT to write their contracts and assist them in court. What I can say is that the prospects for courts saving creators by deciding all generative AI is illegal are dim. Indeed, even if the current cases find that training on the copyrighted works is not okay, that will stop nothing. Right now, the 3 big lawsuits were filed because the creators publicly admitted how their models were trained. No one else is going to do that. Companies are going to be extremely jealous with the details of their training data, specifically to avoid these kind of lawsuits. Moreover, any decision critiquing the methods of training will just tell the programmers to use other data. Train on public domain documents, pay creators for contributions, something like that, or more realistically, use the output of the current models. Estimates vary, but the amount of generative AI content being pushed out is explosive by any metric. ChatGPT is getting about 10 million prompts per day. DALL-E may be generating 2 million images per day, and these are only a fraction of the number of models out there spitting out new content. This new content is already tailor-made for more training because it already pairs input prompts with output. How, as a practical matter, could anyone stop a new model from being trained on the output of the existing models? If you are a creator, don't put your faith in the court system to save your career. Maybe put a little more faith in Congress. Sounds weird to say. After all, if you amend the Copyright Act or make a new law, everything's on the table. But for now, the best defense against generative AI is probably being extremely good at your job. Generative AI has not really been able to match expert-level work yet. As a lawyer, I'm interested to know if I end up getting more work because people cut corners and use ChatGPT for legal advice and get into trouble as a result. As my father always told me, there is always room for the best. Be the best. Now, just because generative AI is here to stay doesn't mean that it's entirely safe to use. It is not. In the next video in the workshop series, we're going to look at the risks and legal issues from the perspective of someone who is using the technology. If you're interested, come back to the channel or visit our website to sign up for the next in-person workshop. See you there.